The European Union is investigating SAP's practices around limiting customers' ability to utilize third-party support. Why are they investigating SAP? What does it mean for you? That's what I want to talk about in this video. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney. For over 20 years, I have drafted and negotiated a variety of technology-related contracts and litigated failed software projects in courts across the country. So the question is, should you have the right to utilize third-party support providers? That's what the EU is investigating, and make no mistake about it, this is a major investigation of what the EU sees as anti-competitive behavior on SAP's part. According to the EU, the SAP has exploited its market dominance to restrict competing service providers and impose restrictions on its customers that prevent them from using third-party providers. Now, it is the first investigation of SAP, though there have been questions about its business practices in this area since 2022, and this is really the first time that this has bubbled up. And if you look at SAP's standard contractual framework, you are going to see a lot of restrictions that are going to be relatively surprising, I think. And the way that they go about this is really multi-factored. First, they're going to have a very broad definition of what constitutes confidential information. And then there is going to be some pretty onerous restrictive covenants around what a customer can do with that confidential information. And be assured that the software in and of itself is going to be defined as confidential or proprietary information that is subject to those confidentiality restrictions. And so, there are going to be carve-outs, there are going to be exceptions, but SAP certainly has the ability to leverage that contract, that contractual obligation to keep its software confidential, to at least make it difficult for you as a customer to provide a third party who is not a party to that contract and has no obligation of confidentiality with respect to that software. They're going to have the ability to leverage that to at least make it difficult for you to utilize, if they want, a third party support provider. The other way that they will do this is through intellectual property provisions that are in the agreement that prevent you as a customer from allowing other people to access and utilize the code. There are going to be express obligations or express prohibitions on your ability to allow other people, third parties, to be able to utilize that software. And it's going to be incumbent upon you as you're negotiating those contracts to really think about who needs to access this software, what kind of flexibility am I going to have, what ability do third parties have to be able to access, utilize, modify the software, support the software so that I can run my business the way I want to. You need to think proactively when you're on the negotiation side of the contract and make sure that you include language in there that at least allows for the possibility of that happening. And a lot of times the way that you would do something like that is you would have a broad and expansive definition of what the scope of use is, what constitutes use. You want to define third parties, and many times SAP will make you responsible. They want somebody to be on the hook. If you're going to be providing access to a third party, they're going to want to make you responsible for that. So, the contract itself is going to be designed in such a way so as to maximize, SAP's opportunity to try to limit your ability to utilize these third-party providers. Now, there is not going to be an express prohibition in the agreement that prevents you from utilizing third-party support and maintenance providers, but there are going to be a lot of provisions in that contract that when they work together, that SAP certainly can leverage to make it difficult for you to utilize a third-party support provider. One of the other things that SAP is notorious for doing, and they've done this for as long as I've been dealing with them, which is many years now, is that if you're not going to get maintenance and support from SAP, they will require you to suspend your maintenance. But if you ever need to go back on the SAP maintenance, what they end up doing is obligating you to pay all the back maintenance that would have been due during the time of your suspended period. So you may go to a third party like Rimini Street, for example, or some other provider of SAP support, be on them for many years. Let's say you're on them for a period of 5 years, and for some reason you need to go back to SAP. They're going to make you pay, and that is one of the things that I think has really got the EU riled up, is these what they would deem unfair business practices, onerous business practices. And if you think about that from just kind of common sense perspective, it's a little bit ironic, right? That you've been paying your third-party support provider for this 5-year period, and now you're no longer paying them, but now in order to get support on a going forward basis, you have to pay SAP for support that they never provided to you in the first place. There's something wrong with that, and I think that is one of the things that the EU is keying in on. How will the EU address this? Well, I don't think it's possible to predict the future, but I think you look at this, and I think what they're going to want is for there to be some contractual changes in the SAP contractual framework. They're going to probably want SAP to split or unbundle support by product or by module, terminate any kind of penalty payments to reinstitute support. They're going to want to have some sort of express language allowing for a customer to utilize third-party support. They're going to want to cap this reinstatement of back maintenance, or make it at least clearer that that is what is going to happen. You never know. There could be some sort of long-term monitoring of SAP on a going forward basis. So I think those are maybe some of the likely outcomes from a contractual perspective that might impact customers directly. And I think it's generally going to be a good thing, but you also need to look at this in the big picture and think about all of the things that are happening at once. So you've got SAP being investigated by the European Union for these unfair business practices regarding support. You've also got the Celonis case that we had talked about in previous videos, where SAP was not allowing customers to utilize a third-party provider of functionality. I think it was data process mining functionality, without paying exorbitant fees. And the reason behind that, at least this is what Celonis said in its lawsuit, was because SAP had a competing product and they wanted the customers to adopt that product. So this kind of behavior is not something that's uncommon with SAP. It's something that they're somewhat known for at this point. And I would expect there to be some sort of a reaction from their customer base in the future if this behavior continues to go on. One of the other things that they're doing, which is certainly not going over very well, is putting arbitrary deadlines, forcing their customer base to migrate to S/4HANA off of their legacy ECC systems. And many of these customers are not doing it. Certainly, one of the reasons why is because there just isn't a business case in certain situations. The Kingfisher example, for one. Some customers are actively not choosing to migrate to S/4HANA and going a different route, using alternative providers of third-party support and employing other alternative strategies to make that ECC system continue to be viable, at least in the short term. And so I think if you look at all of this, all of this is happening. None of this is in a vacuum, right? And the EU is seeing all of these actions that are being taken by SAP. And I think what else might happen besides some of these contractual changes, maybe long-term monitoring of SAP. Well, if you look at it in the consumer space, not the business-to-business space, you look at some of the fines that the EU has issued against Meta. You look at Google. So there's certainly a precedent here that certainly the EU could employ. And I think SAP's got to be very careful about how it plays its hand, because certainly that is not going to be a desirable outcome for SAP. But I do think, from the customer's perspective, the more options that you have, the more ability you have to utilize these third-party providers at a much lower price. I mean, that's certainly good for customer choice. It's certainly not something that SAP wants to see happen, and certainly something that they are trying to nip in the bud as much as they can. But how far is too far? And I'm not sure that we know the answer to that. But certainly we're going to get a sense of what the EU thinks, very shortly. And I do think it's going to have a substantive impact on the way that you interact with SAP, the way that you contract with SAP for support and maintenance, and your ability certainly to use a third-party provider for support and maintenance of your SAP system. If you have any questions about any of the issues I've talked about in this video, feel free to reach out to us. Love to talk to you. Love to get you pointed in the right direction.